Hi, I'm excited to talk to you today about study strategies. I'm Leanne Maxwell, Program Manager with the Dream Big Determined Scholars. I also am an academic coach with my own company, Panther City Partners. So today I'm going to talk about some study strategies that I've used when I talk to students everywhere, but they're especially good for college students. So to get started, yeah, there we go. Okay, so our learning objectives for today's event are we're going to cover some basic tips of study strategies, then very specific study strategies, actual tools that you can use, and then we'll look at the different ways to study for different subjects. And finally, we'll take a little bit of time to reflect on which strategies might be useful for you moving forward. So the basic tips are these. Really, you should be studying smarter, not harder. I have often heard this said that you should study harder, but that's really hard to quantify. Most of the students that I work with, especially our Dream Big Scholars, are high achieving students. And so studying harder doesn't really make a lot of sense because they spend a lot of time studying already. So you really want to study smarter, which means that you need to know and use the most appropriate strategy for each learning situation. And you're going to study for math differently than you're going to study for an English assignment. So studying, knowing the different strategies, which is what we're going to cover today, and then using them at the right time. And then a lot of times I hear students say, I study all the time, but I just don't have anything to show for it. Or I study all the time, but I still don't think I get it. And I would encourage you to really investigate how much time you spend studying and be honest with yourself. If you get to studying and then you spend 10 minutes organizing your papers, and then you spend another 30 minutes calendaring and figuring out when you're going to study things, and then you spend another 10 minutes confirming that everyone can attend the study session, and you've spent an hour studying, but you haven't really done the actual work of studying. So really sit down and take stock of, what am I doing when I study? Am I getting something out of it? Am I actually using my time wisely? And so that's a really good place to start. Just being aware of how much time you spend and what you're doing with that time will help you study smarter. So the main thing about studying your basics are that you have to be flexible. You need to understand that not every strategy works in every class for every student. Something that works for me may not work for other students. Learning a variety of strategies will help with that, because then you can pick and choose the strategy that's working best. If you're using one strategy and it's not working, then you can be flexible and switch to a different strategy. Or you can maybe edit that first strategy a little bit to make it work for you. You also want to, just like what I said, edit, but modify strategies to fit the task at hand and your preference. So if it's not working, maybe you can just tweak it just a little bit to make it work for you. And then remember that more time does not equal better studying. Just because you're spending 4 hours in the library every Saturday doesn't mean you're actually studying well. And so it goes back to that idea of, be honest with yourself about what you're doing with that time. And if 2 hours you can actually be efficient and get the work done, then be flexible with yourself and spend less time. On the same hand, or on a different hand, you might sometimes have to spend more time than what you'd like to spend in order to really get the job done. Okay, so let's talk about some very specific study strategies. And I want to talk about these because I really feel like these are tools that you can use to take with you and use as you study for a test. So I like to think about these tools as a way to understand the material when you're first using it, and then also to use when you review for a test. So sometimes people will say to me like, oh, I'm making my flashcards tonight, my test is tomorrow. Well, creating a study tool when you need to be using it is kind of a little bit too late. So you want to think about creating your study tools and using these specific strategies as you're studying during the regular weeks and during the regular period of class, and then using those tools to review for a test so that you're actually reviewing for a test and not trying to learn the information for the first time right before the test. So these study strategies will help you learn as you go rather than waiting until the end to learn. So the first thing is called a concept card. Now this comes from a book called College Rules, which I love. It's an excellent book. A lot of students that I work with have it. I make sure that they do. But if you don't have it yet, it's easy to find on Amazon, and most of your college bookstores or campus stores will have it. But the concept card is a lot like a flashcard, but it gives you more information. Now, this is important because when you were in elementary school or middle school and you first learned about flashcards, the goal really was just to do rote memorization. You needed to have a term and you needed to have the definition. But now at the collegiate level and the late high school level, what you need to do is apply the information and understand the information fits into a larger concept. And it's not just about understanding this one word as an island, but understanding how it fits in and relates to all the other terms that you're learning in your class and all the other concepts that you're learning in your class. So the concept card still has the term, but you're associating it with a larger concept. And so this can be really good when you have a lot of new terms, but they all fall in a specific category. But it's also really good when you have terms that you know, but they're being applied and used in a new way. So for example, if you have a sociology term and you know what that word means outside of sociology, but now you need to use it in the context of the discipline of sociology, putting that larger concept there really helps you associate it with this new concept and not just with, oh, I understand what this word means, but I understand what this word means in this context. The other thing that's really important to me is really for you to add this page number. Okay. The page number is important because the first time you're creating these cards, you're probably whipping them out pretty quickly. And maybe you're not totally remembering everything. You're creating the front, you're creating the back, and then you're putting it aside. So the next time you go through it, you come up to this term and you're like, oh, I don't really understand this. If you have that page number or the day that you studied it in your notes or some kind of reference to where you can find more information out about it, it's going to make your studying more efficient because you're not going to then spend 20 minutes looking through your book, looking through your notes, rewatching your lectures to understand where this term comes from. You're going to have a reference point immediately. So you can go directly to page 322 and find out more about short-term memory. So you're going to use this a lot like a regular flashcard that you're familiar with. So you're going to read the front side and you're going to try to remember what's on the back side. But the difference is what's on the back side is more than just the definition. So you can see here, the front side of this card said short-term memory. Well, short-term memory really is just that first thing. It's brief and it only lasts about 30 seconds. But if that's all that was on the back of this card, you really wouldn't get the full picture about what short-term memory is. So having the more information, these details like the capacity is only 5 to 9 items, and that the chunking helps you keep additional information in your short-term memory, and that you have to use rehearsal to get information from your short-term memory to your long-term memory, helps give you some context and helps give you some connection for this word. So you're not just learning the word in isolation or learning the term in isolation, you're understanding that it relates to other things that you're also learning about this topic. And then having this example is really important because when your professors test you on this information, they're not just asking for you to give the definition and a few of the details. They're really asking for you to apply the information. So having an example or an application of the term is really going to help you get to that deeper level of understanding. Now, what I like to do is create this as I'm reading or create this like after I've taken notes in class. Or as soon as possible after class, I'll read through those notes and maybe create these cards. And then I'm collecting these cards all through this unit. So if I have class on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm making new cards every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And then I'm also reviewing them on those days and on the days in between. So I'm not just seeing this information one time when I read it or one time when I hear the lecture and take notes, but I'm constantly going back to it. And that's really where you get to that deeper learning instead of just rote memorization or just creating these cards and setting them aside and waiting to only use them when you're reviewing for a test. So you're not going to have learned the information if you're not using them continuously. The next thing to think about using is a concept map. And this is a great strategy when you have things that are related to each other and you have to kind of work it out. This is also, maybe you don't have to work out how they're related, but it's just it's easier for you to see it. So this is great for visual learners and artists and people who prefer to see things instead of just instead of just reading the words. So creating these concept maps really helps you understand the relationship between things. This is a really great thing to do when you've taken the notes in your class and then you want to do something with the notes after class. You can create a concept map. This is an example of annotation. So what I've done here is I have a theories of communication book. And so it may be hard to see, but what I've done here on these sticky notes, this book didn't belong to me. So this is a way to use annotation, but if you don't feel comfortable or you don't want to write on the actual margins of books, then you can use little sticky notes, the small kind of sticky notes, to put in your book and kind of create a page there that you can write your annotations on. But the reason why you'd want to annotate a textbook is so that you don't feel the need to go back and reread the entire textbook. So this particular theory has these like 8 axioms. And so rather than reading this the first time and then feeling like I have to keep returning to it and read it every time I want to study, I've really kind of condensed what the axiom means in my own words and put it on these little sticky notes and annotated on the sides of the pages. Now, this is important because I'm doing a couple of different things here. I'm processing the information and putting it in my own words. I'm also taking something that was longer, maybe a paragraph, and I'm reducing it. So I'm really pulling out just the most important information so that when I study it, I can reread just the most important information. Now it's awesome because kind of like on those concept cards where you want to have the page number, if I'm annotating directly in my book, then if I don't really understand what I pulled out on my annotations, I can easily just go right back to the text and read it there. So some people, maybe your margins aren't large enough, or you don't want to write in your book, or you don't want to use the sticky notes. You can do this on a separate sheet of paper as well. I would just really encourage you to put the page number and the paragraph number or something like that so that you can easily find it in the book when you need to. Over here, you'll notice that this says highlight and underline sparingly. I'm a big fan of using a pencil and underlining, but sometimes I'll have read a page and then I'll look back up at the page and realize that I've underlined almost every sentence or every other sentence. And that's really not pulling out the most important things. So one way to avoid that is to read an entire paragraph and then decide what you're going to highlight. And then take that highlighted word or that highlighted sentence or two and really reduce that down on the side too, putting it in your own words. Okay, so you're having to be a little bit more critical when you're reading when you do this. Use a little bit more analysis, not critical like you don't like it, but critical in thinking about what really is important here and what is not as important, or what do I understand without having to write it out again to the side. So using that sparingly, because you know, if you've highlighted the whole page, then it's really not useful. You just are going to reread the whole page. And that's what we're trying to avoid here. Summaries written in your own words are really the key here. So it's not enough to just highlight or underline a sentence and then rewrite that sentence. You need to rewrite it in your own words because that's helping your brain process the information and really ensure that you understand it. Now, annotating can be done anytime you're reading for pretty much any of your textbooks. And even if you're having to read a novel for English or another class like that. The thing is that you read in smaller chunks and you go ahead at the end of that chunk and determine what you understand. Oftentimes we'll read an entire chapter and then we'll think, gosh, I have no idea what that chapter was about. Well, if you're figuring that out earlier in your reading, I don't understand this, what can I do to fix that? Or how could I understand it better? You're going to get more out of that reading. than if you wait until the end of the chapter and you're like, oh, I don't know what I just read. That's not a good use of your time. So the first few times you annotate, it may take you a little longer, but you're going to get so much more out of reading than if you just read the chapter. Question answer pages are a great thing to use too, especially if you're not wanting to write directly in your book or you don't have note cards, because basically what you're doing here is you are creating a page that kind of looks like Cornell Notes for those of you who have used Cornell Notes, where you're going to put your questions on one side and your answers on the other. So you can see my example here. I've got my questions that I'm going to write over here, and then I'm going to have my answers over here. And my questions, I might create those when I'm doing my pre-reading. I might read the headings and subheadings and the bolded words in a chapter, and I might go ahead and create my questions. And then that way, while I'm reading, I can answer those questions. So I'm making my reading a little bit more active than just being a passive reader. I'm searching for the answers to these questions rather than just reading. And then I'm writing them down. And so what I've created here is a study tool. So kind of like using a concept card where on one side you have the term and then you flip it over and you have the answer and the relationships and the details. I've kind of done that here where I can fold my paper in half where I can only see the questions. And then I read the question to myself and I try to answer it before I look at the answer. So again, creating that study tool early in your, when you're learning the information is going to give you something to use when you're reviewing. Now, professors don't test you over how well you can read through notes. So if that's currently all you're doing to study for tests or to learn information, I would highly encourage you to add in this testing yourself. So another book that I've used a lot when I create these presentations is called How We Learn by Benedict Carey. And he really points to the fact that in order for you to remember something, you have to force yourself to remember it. So you're not really remembering something. It's like a fallacy of remembering. If you just read through something and you're like, yeah, I got this, I understand this. You have to put yourself in a testing situation. So a testing situation can be like a Scantron test where you have to bubble in answers, but it can also be flashcards or these question answer or Quizlet things where you're covering up what the answer is and trying to come up with it off the top of your head. Now, since our brains are designed to forget the first few times you go through your flashcards, you're not going to remember everything, your concept cards or your question answers. But the more you go through them, you're sending signals to your brain that it's important for you to remember this, and then you will remember it. So these strategies are really designed to help you create those study tools that force you to test yourself. Timelines are a great piece of a study strategy that can be used because often we think about a timeline as just a date and an event, but I think it's important to remember that on these, you're also adding the impact. So especially in a history class, but also thinking about like an art history class or a history of theater type class, you don't just need to know when the painting was created and the name of the work. You also may need to know what was going on historically, what was going on in that part of the country or the world at that time when that artwork was created, and how did that influence or impact the artist and the artwork. So having these timelines where you have the dates, but then you have the events and the impacts, gets you further to that higher level critical thinking where you're understanding that things are interrelated and things don't happen in a vacuum. You know, Nixon didn't just install secret tapes to record things in the White House just because, right? Just for no reason. There were other things going on that had an impact on why he made that choice. And then the choice he made had a huge impact on other things. So you can't think about these things in isolation as just events. You need to think about them as events and their impact. A talk through is really great for some of us who are really verbal learners. So this gives you a chance. You can create your question answer, or you can create your timelines, or any of the strategies that we've already used, and then talk through it. Okay, so saying it out loud, just like I'm doing now. I'm in my office alone. I am talking to my computer, it feels like, but I'm talking through this. So the more I talk through it, the better I understand it. You can record yourself saying it. because that's a good way for you to then go back and listen. Then you can go back and listen in like other passive times, like you're cleaning your room and you just put your headphones in and listen to yourself explain what you were learning, so that you don't always have to be like with a book and doing it. You can be doing other things to help your brain think, oh, this is important enough to remember. But you can also explain it to someone else. So if you say it out loud and you don't understand it, to yourself, you say it out loud, to a recording, to a friend, a classmate. If you don't say it, if you don't understand something when you've said it out loud, then you don't understand it. So sometimes you have to hear yourself say it before you realize that you don't understand it. I have often written a paper, or I've read through someone's paper helping them edit, and I have to say it out loud before I realize, oh, something is wrong here. Or when I'm reading a textbook like that Theories of Communication textbook, it's really dense. And sometimes I have to read the passages out loud so that I can not just read it, but I can hear it. So I'm processing in two different ways. I'm processing it auditorily, and then I'm also processing it reading wise. So the talk through is a way to use any of your study tools and really confirm that you do understand it. So all of those study strategies can be used for lots of different subjects, but the important thing to think about here is that you want to study for different subjects differently. So I'm going to go through each of those different types of subjects and talk about what are some strategies you can use when you study them. So thinking about sciences, and even just understanding that there are different types of sciences, some people just lump science and math all together, like it's all just one big thing, but it's really not. There's different areas of science, and you study them differently and you use them differently. So thinking about exact sciences being different from biological, physical, and engineering and computer sciences helps maybe you understand that, oh, studying for exact sciences is more about doing problems, and biological sciences maybe more about vocabulary and understanding relationships. So even just understanding that big, broad, the different types of sciences or fall under different categories can be helpful in your studying. So what's the main focus in studying for sciences? Well, you are going to be studying basic principles and theories. Your professors are really going to stress relationships, and most sciences are taught in some kind of sequential or hierarchical order, meaning that you need to understand the big stuff before you can understand the little stuff, or you need to understand the stuff from the first part of the semester before you can understand the later stuff in the semester. You have to understand the different components of a cell before you can understand how viruses affect cells. So you have to have those basic understandings before you can get into the more complex understandings. There's going to be a lot of new terms and new definitions, and a lot of times diagrams. So mapping things out or writing things out, rewriting diagrams or putting them into a concept map to make you understand them better, and using those concept cards is really helpful here. When you go into a science class, especially at the collegiate level, your professor is going to want you to have already have an understanding of the scientific method, and then also understand the relationship between scientific principles and proofs. So just that's a really basic understanding, but then your professor can capitalize on that. If you don't know these basic things before you start a science class, then you're going to need to do a little bit of work on the front end so that you can understand these things before you move forward. Because the professor is just going to drop these terms in there thinking that you know them in a lecture and not really explain them. So if you don't understand them, figure that out early and learn them. You can expect in science classes to have objective tests. So there is a right answer. You're going to be solving problems in exact sciences. So for chemistry and for physics, you're going to be doing equations. And then there's going to be lab tests. And sometimes you're going to have a lecture and a lab, and you're kind of studying the same thing, but it's going to feel like very different because you're tested in different ways. So understanding that on the front end will help make those classes a little easier. So you should use those concept cards, use strategies for connecting ideas like concept maps, and talk through the information. Really do your practice problems, especially in those exact sciences, even if you don't have to turn them in for a grade. Using study groups so that you can hear other people's explanations, and then you can share yours and y'all can come to like, okay, we really do understand this. Watching videos and animations of science processes, there are countless videos out there from professors at different universities, from scientists, from non-professional scientists, where they have taken these processes and created videos. So use YouTube as your friend when you're studying these processes. And really, you need to read before class so that you know the new terms, so that you're not frantically writing things down in your class that you should know before you got to lecture. Okay, so we've talked about sciences. Now we're going to talk about social sciences, and they're a little bit different. These are the things that have a social orientation or the study of cultures, political orientation, and then some business classes. These focus really on the theories about what generally happens in society. So when you have the word science in there, people often think that it's exact or that it's only facts. But social sciences often take people's stories and pull out the themes on those stories, and then they measure things. And the main struggle that people have is that they confuse with social sciences is that they confuse fact and opinion. So really be paying close attention to that when you're reading and going to those lectures. Your textbooks are going to use organizational aids to help organize information, visual aids, and photographs, kind of to make it feel relevant and to make it feel like, oh, this is involving real people. You're going to have terms that are used in new and specialized meanings. So this is what I was talking about earlier about how this can help by creating those concept cards, understanding the larger concept and what class it's in, so that when you see a word stratification, you'd understand that it's not talking about rocks, maybe it's talking about social stratification. So those words mean somewhat same thing, that there's layers or that there's different groups, but stratification in rocks looks a little different than social stratification. So understanding that those terms have specialized meanings. Your professors are going to expect you to already know something about people, right? That how people in societies function. They're going to expect you to be able to distinguish fact from fiction and understand that social sciences are an interpretation of events. They're not an objective recounting. So you're not necessarily getting exact things, but you're interpreting what you see. So if you observe first, like a sociology, if you observe several managers and employees, several different of those kinds of relationships, what is the interpretation that you can make about manager and employee relationships based on all of those different observations? You can expect papers, lots of papers writing about, case studies and what you're learning, essays, short answer tests, group projects, and your tests are going to have both objective questions and writing. So you're going to need to know some memorization like terms, but then you're also going to have to apply those in your writings. For this, you're going to use a lot of the same things. You're going to do concept cards, strategies, talk-throughs, practice problems, study groups, and really that understanding new terms, or at least the way that those new terms are used for that discipline, is going to be helpful in the social sciences. Now, your humanities classes include things like your literature, English, foreign literature and writing, philosophy and theology, any of your fine arts classes, and your history classes. Now, that's a really broad range of subjects, but the main thing that you want to focus on is that all of these are going to require you to think critically and interpret your readings, okay? Historical events are going to be organized chronologically. So this is going to include not just in your history classes, but also in your writing classes. Or if you're reading writings from a certain era, you're going to have to understand the historical events around that too. The same thing for if you're understanding the history of theater, it's not just about when the play was written, but what was happening around that same time. And thinking about what those movements or the Elizabethan age, what does that mean? And what is that time period and what was happening all during that? This one, you're going to have a lot of new and old terms. And you're going to see lots of visual aids in your textbooks, timelines, there's going to be some videos, and then graphs and diagrams and art. Those are going to be your focuses. Now, you should already understand the basic structure of stories, plays, and poetry. Understanding that there's a beginning, middle, and end, there's a climax, there's a denouement, that kind of thing. You're going to want to understand symbolism, themes, and figurative language, and then historical chronology and general movement. So understanding that the Enlightenment period happened, after the Middle Ages. And then all of these classes are going to require that you have good writing skills, grammar, and spelling. And so if you haven't found where your school's writing center is yet, or you haven't used that resource on your campus, this is a good time for you to go ahead and find where it's located, figure out the hours, figure out what it looks like for you to turn something in and what's the turnaround time for them to get it back to you. So if you have all of that stuff understood before you need the writing center, it's going to be a lot easier for you to use the writing center. You can expect that humanities classes are going to have a big writing emphasis. And that's important to know. So because you maybe don't want to take 3 writing emphasis classes, 3 humanities classes in the same semester. So this is helpful to know, not just in studying, but also when you're planning your schedules for each semester. There's going to be a lot of compare and contrast, analyze and interpret, and then how history influenced art, music, and theater, and then identify music, art, and theater creators. You should annotate. You want to concentrate on key conclusions and the most important supporting information. You're really going to use those timelines. You're going to use those question and answer pages when you're reading, but also to test yourself. And then you want to be reading with a critical eye. Really, if an English professor assigns a book, what's the purpose of this book? What are you trying to learn about? Is it this book about the theme? You're trying to understand themes? Is this book really focusing on characterization or setting? Really reading with a critical eye and understanding why you're reading this in this section of your class. Foreign languages are kind of something different altogether, okay? When you first start in a foreign language, especially if it's a new foreign language, you're going to be doing a lot of stuff on vocabulary, grammar rules, sentence construction, culture, people, really just kind of getting an overview of this new language. But it's going to be pretty quickly, it's going to get more difficult. So the first of the course is easy, but then everything builds. So you're going to have to do a lot of memorization at first. So concept cards are great. But after about a semester of a foreign language, you're going to get into more difficult. So you're not just learning words now. Now you're conjugating verbs and you're creating sentences, which then is creating longer paragraphs and stories. So you really want to you have to apply your knowledge of vocabulary and verb conjugation to your reading and understanding and speaking and writing. You should study every day for a foreign language, every single day. Learn the verbs, get into the culture, do all the practice activities, even if they're not required. Really using those concept cards is going to be helpful. And then immerse yourself, travel if you can. We can't right now. So change your, if you're watching a show on Netflix, put it in Spanish or put it in the language that you're learning. Immerse yourself in that. Follow people on Twitter that are writing in that language, read books that are in that language, listen to podcasts that are in that language. I like this idea of having a language hour. So you could get together with some of your other classmates or some of your friends who speak that foreign language. And you could have an hour where, okay, we're going to do nothing but speak this language. And even if we get it wrong, we're still going to push ourselves through it, because that's kind of getting into that immersion. And then never miss a lab. So if you have a listening lab associated with your foreign language, do not miss those. So foreign language was a little different than some of your other classes, and then math is also different than your other classes. So in some ways, math and foreign language are actually more similar than they are to those other disciplines, because you need to do them every day. It's kind of like learning a new language, and you should always do the practice problems, even if they're not required. The thing about math, though, is that a lot of us have a fixed mindset about math, like I just can't do math. Therefore, I'm not going to put much effort into my homework, because I think even if I put a lot of effort into it, I'm still not going to learn it. So really shifting from that fixed mindset of like, I can't learn math, to this growth mindset of with practice and patience and persistence, I can learn it, is going to help you put more effort into your work. And then a lot of times the struggle that people have with math is not that they don't understand it, it's that they don't have the background. So if I suddenly find myself not understanding new terms and new equations in math, it's probably because I don't understand the stuff from early, the basics in that class. So really getting those basics down like you have to in a foreign language so that you can understand the more complex problems later. People are always saying, like, why do I have to learn math? I'm never going to use this. And so, really, the practical use of math is not necessarily about doing the actual math equations, unless you're in a field like civil engineering. My spouse is a civil engineer, and he really does use those calculations on a daily basis. But for the rest of us who are in fields that don't have a big math heavy practice with practical use, really what we're doing when we learn math is understanding the underlying problem solving skills. So we're using those problem solving skills in math, and then we're using them in other places. The thing about math is if you're in the wrong math class, you need to get yourself out of it. So if you are in calculus, but you really should be in pre-calculus, you need to do something about that as soon as possible. Because since math builds on each other. If you don't understand the pre-calculus, you're not going to understand the calculus. If you're in calculus 2, but you should really be in calculus 1, course correct, okay? There is nothing worse than getting to the end of a really hard math class and realizing that you should actually have been in a different math class. Your grade's going to suffer, and then also your confidence in math is going to suffer. This is especially hard for some of you high achievers who did so well in high school math. And you're like, oh, I took calculus in high school. I'm going to take calculus 2 in college. Well, it's different because your high school teacher taught calculus over the course of an entire year. And now you're putting yourself in a class that's the next level up, and you've only got a semester. So you had to have a really strong foundation, and you have to be okay with moving quickly. So you've moved into a rigorous, fast-paced class, and maybe your skills were not as good as you thought they were going in. Now, this is not knocking high school classes. They are just designed differently, okay? They are designed to go at a little bit of a slower pace, and they are designed with the teacher being the one who's asking, do you understand? If you don't, tell me that you don't understand so I can help you. Whereas college classes are designed to be faster paced, and the onus of learning, the responsibility for learning is now on the student. So instead of the professor saying, did you get it? Do you understand? You have to be asking yourself those questions. And if you don't understand, you have to get help early. So reflecting early and often and getting help when you need it. For math classes, you should definitely stay current. Do not fall behind on your homework because then you will be lost. Talk things through and by putting the words to the formulas. So rather than just writing out E equals mc squared, what does that actually mean? I know that that's not math, it's physics, but that's the problem I came up with on the spot. Put that into words. What do all those letters mean? What are you saying when you say that equation? Read your textbooks. Oftentimes, if you're just doing the problems, you're not really understanding the why or the how of the problem. So reading those textbooks to really get that deeper level understanding will help you beyond just doing the problem. Practice, practice, practice. You cannot get better at math if you're not willing to practice it. It's like a foreign language. I said this earlier, and that you need to review it daily. Using concept cards for math can be really great, especially for formulas, because on the back, you wouldn't just put like what the formula does, but why it's important or how you use it or in what setting you would use this kind of formula. So if I'm trying to do the formula for the circumference of a circle, I'm going to have the formula on one side of my concept card. I'm going to have geometry or whatever is my larger concept. I'm going to put my page number on there. And then when I flip over, I'm going to write circumference of a circle, but then I'm going to define each of the different pieces of that equation so that I don't just look at the equation and not understand what everything means. If there's an R in there and I'm talking about the circumference of a circle, that must stand for radius. But I want to put that on the back of my concept card so that I have that information right there. taking really good lecture notes and attending those classes. Um, this is important. Reflecting. Do my answers or solutions make sense? So just the other day, our son was doing a math problem, and my spouse, his dad, was helping him with it. And my son said, "Oh, Daddy, the answer I got here doesn't make sense." And when they looked at the problem together, it was a completely wrong answer. So he had done the work and he got an answer, but instead of just putting it into the computer program to like, this is my answer, he reflected for a moment of like, the answer I got here doesn't make sense. So I must have done something wrong. So look at your answers and see, does this make sense in this situation? And if not, go back and to each step and figure out what you did wrong. Ask questions early and often. If you don't understand something early in the semester or early in the class, you're not going to understand it any better later when when the professor has turned it into an even more complex problem. Okay. So asking questions early and often is important. And then drawing out those diagrams or using manipulatives or doing something that makes it more tangible so that you understand it more fully. And it's not just an equation. Um, so that's the different ways to study in those different disciplines, or at least things to understand. And I think it's important before I talk about the things that you can do for across all disciplines, it's important to understand the differences in those disciplines when you're creating your schedule so that, like I said, you don't wind up with 3 humanities classes and have 8 papers due over the course of a semester. So thinking about, I want to have a science class, I want to have a social science, a humanities, a math class, so that you can balance your schedule a little bit more is going to be really helpful. The asking early and often is really important so that you understand if you really know things, okay? So regardless of whether it's math or something that you find easier, understanding the basics is super important. So if you don't understand something early in the semester, ask for help, okay? This is really important. That's what it says here. Start strong to build a foundation. If you don't get the early things, you're not going to understand the things that are later. Because early in a semester, you're talking about things kind of individually. But then later in the semester, you're putting all those things together and you still have to understand it. So for example, I had a student in a calculus class, and she understood how to do each step of a problem. But when she got to the test, her professor put all those different steps into one problem and she was struggling. So she was thinking of math as being like islands. I need to know how to do this. And then I need to know how to do this. And then I need to know how to do this. But what her professor wanted her to know was, how do those 3 steps connect? And when you put them all together, what's your answer going to be? The same thing can be said for pretty much any of your classes. Please don't think about the things that you're learning as in a vacuum. You're not just learning the parts of a cell. You're learning the parts of a cell so that you can understand how viruses impact a cell or how they multiply. You're not learning individual things. You're learning things that are all connected to each other. And so really trying to see that arc over the course of a semester of what you're learning, not just looking at individual sections. Across all discipline, daily practice is really important. So that means you're doing a little bit of work for all of your classes every day. And that may mean that you're spending less time each day, but you're doing it over the course of many days. Do your homework, please. Even if you don't have to turn it in, that's where you learn the information. Getting fresh eyes on something. So for example, if you've written a paper, write your paper early if you can, put it away, and then the next day look at it and edit it before you turn it in. Because when you've slept on it, we're going to talk about sleep in a second, when you have fresh eyes on something, you always see something new. So really capitalizing on that and using it. Change your study strategies if they're not working. So if you've been using flashcards and they're no longer working for you, how could you modify that study strategy or use something different to make it work for you? There is no one right way to study for every person, for every class, for every semester. So really assessing, is this working? If it's not, what could I do differently? Who could I ask for help? How could I change my study practices? The last thing I'm going to say about across discipline, this is not true. This is not the last thing I'm going to say about across disciplines. I have one more thing, but sleep is so important, y'all. Our brains, and this is one of the things that I've learned from that book, How We Learn. Our brains process so much information over a night while we're sleeping. And if we don't actually get into REM sleep, we don't get enough sleep to get there, then our brains won't process the information. So having a bedtime routine, having a morning routine, sticking to that schedule as much as possible, and not studying all night long. You have to give your brain time to rest so it can process the information that you're just shoving into it all the time. Okay, so now the last thing I'm going to say for across disciplines is sectioning off your hours. Okay, so when you study, when you sit down to study, you don't just want to sit down and open up your book and start flying through the material. You want to be intentional about how you're using your study time. So my suggestion is that for the first 5 minutes of your study hour, and I would block it off into an hour, you're going to make a plan. You're going to be very detailed about what are you going to accomplish over the study hour. Read chapter 7, annotate. Read notes from Thursday, create concept cards. Look at textbook and create concept map. So be very specific about what you're going to do. Okay. Then for about 45 minutes, you're going to do that work and you are going to mark through those things as you get them accomplished. And then whether you are finished with that to-do list or not, you're going to stop and you're going to take a 10-minute break. You're going to get up, you're going to walk around, you're going to go outside, you're going to see the light of day, something to let your brain rest for a minute. Okay. You're letting your brain rest, you're processing things. And then when you go back, you'll have fresh eyes. So at the end of that study hour, you're taking a 10-minute break. And then you can do it all over again. Okay. If you want to keep studying for the same subject, do the same thing again. Look at your original to-do list. Did you get to everything? If not, then put that stuff on your new to-do list. Now, the to-do list is important because it gives you something to show for your study time. But also, we are really terrible at estimating how long it's going to take us to accomplish our study tasks. So I may sit down with that Theories of Communication book and think, oh, I can get through a chapter in an hour. So I'm going to write that on my to-do list. And then I'm going to do my work for 45 minutes. And then I'm going to realize, oh, I only got through half of this chapter. So you're learning as you go how long it's going to take you to do something so that you can course correct and make better use of your time. Now, you want to make your plan, be intentional about it for 5 minutes, study for 45, and then take a 10-minute break. So the things that I'd like for you to think about on your own are, what are your thoughts about how to study for different disciplines? Does that make sense to you? Do you see it now that you've kind of watched this presentation and thought through it? Does that resonate with you of, oh yeah, I do study for different tests in different ways? Think about, what will you try? Have I said something here today that maybe you've never thought of before, or that a strategy that you've never used, and will you try it? And then think about what works for you now and how can you capitalize or how can you capitalize on that? Sorry, my phone was ringing. I needed to turn it off real fast. How can you capitalize on what's working for you and apply it to other classes? Taking that time every day to reflect, do I understand what I'm reading? Do I understand what I'm learning? And if not, where can I get help? And when can I get help? That really sets you apart as a student and an academic in a way that some people just aren't thinking about school. They're just thinking about doing the work, but they're not taking that time to reflect, is the work working? Am I getting something out of this? And that's a piece of studying that you have to be doing on a daily basis so that you're not just spinning your wheels. None of you have time to study for 2 hours and not have anything to show at the end of it. So really be asking yourself at the end of every of your hours of studying, did I learn something? And if I didn't, what do I need to do differently, or where can I get help? So we talked about the basic tips for studying. We talked about very specific study strategies. We have there's different ways to study for different subjects, and that there's different things you need to know. And then we talked about the importance of really taking some time to reflect on your study strategies and your habits, to determine if they're working, and if they're not, what could you do differently? Or if they are, how could you use those in other areas of your studying? Thank you so much for your time today. The books that I used to create this presentation are College Rules. I use the fourth edition, How to Study, Survive, and Succeed in College. And then also How We Learn by Benedict Carey. These two books are invaluable when you are in college, especially College Rules. How We Learn is really interesting, but you might wait until a break to read that. But College Rules, I would highly suggest you get that and start using it as a reference. If those of you who are my Dream Big Scholars, if you want to go over any of this in more detail, or want to get fine tune some of your study strategies, hey, this is working, Leanne, but how can I make it better? Or hey, this isn't working, what could I do to modify it? Please reach out to me and we can set up a one-on-one session so that I can get you that help that you need. Thank you so much for your time. Have a great day.